It really is a genuine pleasure for me to welcome Henry Olsen, who is a weekly, or even sometimes more than once a week. 5 times a week. 5 times a day is a lot of op-eds. He is a regular columnist for the Washington Post, and he's also a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He has, and I'm going to mention one of his degrees, he has his law degree from the University of Chicago, so you know he isn't entirely stupid. In fact, far from it. And one interesting little piece of information, he won $250,000 on I Want to Be a Millionaire 19 years ago. Now, whether he's blown it all since then, I'm not sure, but let me please ask you to welcome Henry Olsen to speak to us about where the race is. He'll be talking about the presidential election, some of the Senate elections, and the Montana election for the Senate. Henry.
Thank you very much, Vince. I appreciate that. Vince and I have known each other for well over a decade, and through our collaboration and a previous job that I held as research director and vice president at the American Enterprise Institute, where I discovered Vince was a what you would say 5-tool talent in baseball. He was a man who could understand agricultural policy, he could write about agricultural policy, he could talk about it, and he could speak to legislative staff about it, which is exactly what the tools we need as a public policy intellectual, and we've become friends since, and I appreciate the invitation for my first trip to Bozeman, and I'll be going off to interview Governor Bullock in my capacity as a Washington Post columnist in Helena. So thank you for introducing me to Montana's beauty, and judging from the Main Street, it's relative civilization too. Boy, you have nice stores here. But you're not here to hear me talk about Vince or to tell you that the question I walked away from with $250,000 was how many Stooges or actors played in the comedy trio, The Three Stooges, 4, 5, 6, or 7. I didn't know the answer. I walked away. The Stooges are dead to me. Never talk about Stooges. You're here to talk about the election. And what I want to do is give you a brief overview and then dive down and give you the reasons why I come to the conclusion of the brief overview. The first point I want you to understand is that the state of play right now, both at the presidential level and below it, is highly favorable to the Democrats. The reason for that isn't hard to guess. President Trump and his policies, but particularly his character and his behavior, have polarized an already polarized electorate to new extremes. So that means that if you don't like Trump, you are highly likely to also vote against local Republican candidates for federal office. And if you do like Trump, you are highly likely to vote for candidates or Republican candidates for federal office, regardless of how you voted 5 years ago. That's the first point. The second point is that because of this and because of Trump's relative standing throughout the last year, and particularly since COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd, it not only looks likely that Trump will lose, it looks highly likely that the Democrats will take control of the United States Senate, that they will gain seats in the House as opposed to lose seats, which is unusual because the Democratic majority includes 30 members who hold seats that Donald Trump won in 2016, including some very, very Republican seats historically. Normally, you would expect that a majority that holds ground like that would lose some of that unnatural majority. Instead, if current trends hold, they will likely go deeper into traditional Republican territory, not retreat from it. And the third point I want to say is that this will be a high turnout, high partisan election. People talk about how America tends to lag behind other countries in the world with respect to voter turnout. Over the past 10 years, that has been less true than it was when I was in my mid-30s. We had about 63% of eligible adults. By that, I mean people who were not imprisoned, people who are actually citizens. They could have registered, they could have voted. We had about 63% people turn out. In the Anglosphere, places like Canada and Britain, they tend to only have a few percentages higher than that. We will probably meet or exceed those percentages because of the high degree of interest that is shown. This means that we'll probably have a voter turnout closer to 70 to 75%, which means a record number of ballots will be cast. And they will be cast, as I mentioned, largely on a partisan basis. We'll get to that in Montana because Montana is one of the very few exceptions to that rule for reasons that are unique to Montana. But in the rest of the country, you will largely see Republicans and Democrats wavering only a couple of percent in each state or in each district from what Donald Trump or Joe Biden will get. And that means that unless the state is extremely close, or unless the district is extremely close, whoever carries that at the presidential level will see candidates coming behind them at the other levels. This is the sort of voting that America used to have until the 1960s. That it used to be that you would see huge partisan sweeps because people would change their minds based on the top of the ticket and then vote all the way down. There's a humorous story that's probably anecdotal, but it serves to reflect that, and that is during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. There was a story of a judge candidate in Brooklyn, about as minor as you can get, but in New York, judges are elected by party. And he goes into the local Democratic Party headquarters, boss's office, and says, "You didn't put my signs up. I'm not going to win. You start campaigning for me." And the person calmly takes him to the window overlooking the harbor and you say, "You see that tugboat down there?" And the judge candidate says, "Yeah." "And you see the garbage that is coming sucked into the bay in the wake of the tugboat?" He says, "Yeah." And the guy looks at him and he says, "The tugboat is Franklin Roosevelt. You're the garbage." There will be many people elected who will think it'll be because of them this time, but it's not. It'll be a partisan election. So what are the factors that we need to be looking at? Obviously, campaigns do matter. And the margin for error with the Democrats between victory and defeat is actually rather slim, despite what it appears to be right now. And that is that right now, and I looked literally before, as Vince was introducing me, so I had the up-to-date moment, Trump is behind Biden by 7% in the Real Clear Politics average of national polls. And I believe that that's the best polling average to look at. You should always look at averages rather than individual polls, and the Real Clear Politics average has a good record of coming close to being accurate. He is at 43.9% job approval rating, and he is minus 10.6% in that rating, which is say that 10.6% more or 54.5% disapprove of his rating. If that holds, if Trump does not improve his job approval rating and does not close, this will be a landslide election for the Democrats. The reason why is because presidents who are running for re-election for the past 48 years have always gotten within a few percentage points, and in all but one instance, within 1.5 percentage points of their final job approval rating. That's because when you're running for re-election, no matter what you want to do, you have to make it into a contrast with your opponent, but it's really a referendum on you. So as much as Trump tries to say, look at Biden, look at the Democrats, look at the squad, you don't want to walk down that path. He's not likely to make up this ground unless he also gets people to begin to think that he's doing at least a good enough job to be worthy of trust for another 4 years. So you look at this and say, well, he's down by 11, he's down by 7, it's the end of August. That's pretty hard to come back from. But let's consider this. Trump won the presidency while losing the popular vote by about 2 percentage points in 2016 because the nature of his coalition is what I call electorally efficient. Mitt Romney got 47% of the vote in 2012 and lost the Electoral College, not in a landslide, but pretty decisively. Trump got 1% less and won not as decisively as President Obama, but pretty close. There's only a small difference in that. And the reason why is because Trump's coalition combines traditional Republican voters, particularly the highly religious, and that's true regardless of religion, which is that I can point to you highly religious Orthodox Jewish precincts in New York that are as Republican as highly religious Catholic precincts in Chicago or religious evangelical precincts in the South. It's a question of religiosity more than it is a question of denomination. And he combines less religious, but not liberal or not progressive white working class voters of all sorts of ethnicities. And if you followed politics, you've heard a lot of talk about that over the last few years. If you look at a map that shows the change between Romney and Trump, it looks a lot like the map if you're looking at a Arctic chill in January, which is to say the big change dips down from the Canadian border into the central part of America and kind of like a parabola curve, because that's where those voters live. The less religious, but not progressive, not liberal, white working class tends to congregate in places like eastern Montana or Butte. And within Montana, the county where Trump did best compared to Romney is Silverboe, which is Butte, which is historically Democrat. He still lost it. He just lost it by a significantly lower margin because less religious, white working class voters in economically depressed or stagnant areas liked Trump's message. The Democratic coalition is a combination of secular whites and non-whites, along with a large number of voters in the middle, which is not, they get some white working class voters, some highly religious voters, but not many. But they traditionally need to do well among college-educated voters in the suburbs. The reason why Trump has moved from being only 2 points behind when he lost to Clinton to now being 7 points behind with Biden and now nearly 11 points on job approval is because a lot of college-educated whites who reluctantly voted for Trump in 2016 now disapprove of him and are currently supporting Biden. So if you look at polls, what you'll find is that whites with a college degree favor Democrats by historically large margins. Now, these are not liberals by the way we would understand these voters. In 2018, you can look at where these voters tossed out Republican representatives for the US House, where they tossed out state representatives, and nonetheless see that they also cast votes for Republicans for governor or Republicans for state office. They are still people who are up for grabs, but they are currently so upset with Trump that they're willing to vote on the federal level in a partisan Democrat manner. This is the battleground for the election. As recently as March, Trump was within striking distance of victory. If you look at the electoral map, you see that Trump could lose the national popular vote by even more than he lost in 2016 and still win enough states in the Electoral College to be reelected. Those of us who do this for a living disagree slightly among us as to what the percentage gap is. Some people say 2.5%, some people say 3%, some people say 4%, some say as much as 5%. I tend to say 3%. If he's behind by 3 nationally, he will win the Electoral College. If he's behind by 4, he's got a shot at the Electoral College, and anywhere in between is kind of like a coin flip. So go back to what I said earlier. Trump will get what his job approval rating was. Before COVID struck, his job approval rating was roughly 46.5%. A little bit below where he needs to be, but he was only upside down by 4 points in job approval, and he was behind by Biden by only slightly more than 4 points as of when COVID struck. In early April, he got a small post-COVID bounce, which is to say that throughout the world, whether the incumbent government was center-right, center-left, left or right, incumbent governments around the world saw a rise in their approval ratings and in their party's support scores and polls after the COVID crisis struck. Again, that's true across the globe. Trump got the smallest bounce of any leader, save one or two. But that bounce was enough so that in the first week of April, his job approval rating was roughly 47.3, 47.2, which would have projected to losing the popular vote by 2 to 3 points and winning the Electoral College. The battleground for Trump is how to get from today, where he's at 43.9, up to 47. If he can do that over the next 7 weeks, he's got a shot at re-election. And that's why, if you are watching or reading about the Republican National Convention, they are doing what they're doing. They're finally coming to grips with the fact that millions of people who may approve of Trump's policies dislike him and his character. So you see in the first two nights a lot of emphasis on compassion, a lot of placing Trump in circumstances where yesterday he had led a naturalization ceremony at the White House. On day one, he had meetings in the White House with individuals who like hostages who came home during his administration, or healthcare workers who had battled on the front line of COVID, a couple of whom who had actually contracted COVID, to talk about their experiences. This is meant to demonstrate that Trump is and can be a compassionate, empathetic, and effective leader. Now, if you're like any other group of 22 college students in a normal American university, at least 5 of you are internally giggling at that. But that's exactly what they need to do, and you're not their audience. If you're giggling at that, you're not their audience. Their audience is the person who approved of Trump as recently as March, and they want that person to come back. Their secondary audience is the person who may not have voted in 2016, a white working class voter in rural Michigan or rural Wisconsin or even eastern Montana, but who may say, this time it's worth it. This time I need to cast my first vote in a long time because the stakes are that high. Those are their two audiences. Everyone else doesn't really matter for this convention, or really if they do their job for the next 5 weeks. The base is already with them. The Republican Party is with them. They need to stoke that a little bit, but they really need to focus on the message of the first 2 days. And we will then find out whether this is going to be a race or not. The Democrats are on the opposite position. Their path to victory is to keep the focus on what unites their coalition. They have a very disparate coalition. They have hardline progressives who like the idea of Bernie Sanders' phrase, our revolution. They have mainstream Democrats who tend to be liberal, but prefer reform to revolution. I wrote about that split 10 years ago in my election prediction essay in 2010, that in the Democratic Party, what tends to divide the so-called moderates from the so-called liberals, or now we would say the so-called liberals from the so-called progressives, has less to do with policy and more to do with tactics, with the speed of implementation and the degree to which you should accommodate the existing views of the electorate. Progressives and strong liberals tend to say full speed ahead, we'll use the courts, we'll push through far-reaching changes when we have temporary majorities. Liberals and moderates tend to say, whoa, Nelly, let's take a third of a loaf when we can get it, and 5 years from now we'll get the next third of a loaf. They combine that with these new voters who, as recently as 2012 and 2014, enthusiastically voted for Republicans. You saw many of those people on stage at the Democratic Convention saying, John Kasich, I was a Republican, Susan Monari, I was a Republican, I need to back Joe Biden. They introduced a Republicans for Biden group on Monday, 28 former members of Congress who are now saying they will back Biden. Those people haven't changed their minds so much on policy. They are united on defeating Trump and excising what they believe to be a malign influence within the Republican Party. So the path for Trump is, once you've rehabilitated yourself, you can get some of these voters to come back to you positively, then you talk to the remainder and make it a choice election. So if he's at 46% job approval rating, he then starts saying, now for the rest of you, you don't like Joe Biden, but you don't like, he won't say it this boldly, but this will be what it'll be. You don't like Joe Biden and you don't like me. But think about what you're agreeing to if you agree to Joe Biden. And you're agreeing to a candidate who will at least tolerate disorder in the streets. I mean, we've had 3 days of rioting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and 2 people died last night. This isn't protest, this is violence. And the Democratic Party is stuck between a revolutionary wing of their party that doesn't see very much wrong with that, and the much larger part of their party that does, but shares many of the beliefs and goals, and these moderates who probably are farther to the right on all of that. The Trump campaign will, on a host of issues, taxes, economy, law and order, American patriotism, try and drive a wedge between these new Democrats and the traditional Democrats of whatever variety. That's Trump's path for victory. First, rehabilitate himself up to a level 2 or 3 or 4 points ahead of where he is, and then concentrate for the remaining last % or 2 on these people who will go into the election booth and say, I really don't want Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. I really don't want Donald Trump. Which person do I want least? The odds are against Trump doing that. The reason why is, even though as of March he was in striking distance, and even though as in April he was actually in the victory zone, those were very recent occurrences. He had not been consistently above 46% job approval rating for the preceding 3 years of his presidency. He cannot win the election, and Republicans cannot hold the Senate if he is below that level. It's possible that he can turn around 4 years of history in the last 10 weeks. It's possible that events which conspired to be against him in the last 4 months will conspire to be in his favor in the next 2 months. But if you're a betting person, bet against that happening and bet on the likelihood of a Democratic clean sweep. And then the question is, what are the margins of victory? And that brings me to the Senate. Senate races have become nationalized in the last decade. They've become super nationalized during this president, which is, say, going back as far as 2012, very few Senate candidates win a state when their party's presidential candidate loses it, or in the case of midterms, when their party's incumbent president has a job approval rating above 50%. The rough cusp mark you should look at with respect to whether the Democrats can control the Senate is, does Biden win by 4% nationally or more? And that's because of which seats are up. Republicans control 53 to 47 in the Senate right now. They will, 99% certainty, win back the Alabama Senate seat that they lost only because the Republicans nominated a historically awful candidate in Judge Roy Moore in the 2017 special election, and he still only lost by 1 percentage point or 2. So that means every serious election observer says Republicans go in with a real 54 seat rather than 46. If Biden wins the presidency, they need to gain 4 Republican seats. Recall what I said about the symmetry between presidential races and state races. 2 Republican senators up for re-election represent states that Trump lost by 5% or more, Susan Collins of Maine and Cory Gardner of Colorado. Republicans desperately want to believe they've both got a shot. But if any Republican walks up and wants to bet me, I will take whatever odds they want to give, because the likelihood of that happening, absent some sort of bizarre revelation about the Democratic opponents, is next to none. So then we focus on the next 2 most Democratic seats. And they are in, with Republican comes, and they are in Arizona and North Carolina. Trump carried both states by roughly 3.5 points in 2016. If he loses, and in Republican candidates in states like that, these are also states that, because they have a high number of college-educated whites and a large number of non-white minorities, tended to shift against the Republicans in 2018. If Trump loses nationally by 4% or more, it is likely that he will be behind in both of those states, because the sorts of constituencies that have moved against him are larger in those places. And it's very unlikely that a Republican senator, Tom Tillis in North Carolina or Martha McSally in Arizona, will win where Trump is losing. particularly since both Tillis and McSally have tended in polls to run behind the president, not ahead of the president. Now, again, that could change. It could be that in late October, those Republicans who don't like Trump will say, well, I'm going to split my ballot. I'm going to do something I haven't done in a decade. I'm going to vote Democrat for president, but I'm going to vote Republican for Senate to hold Biden accountable. If that starts to happen, you'll see it in the polls, and then I'll change my outlook. But right now, it looks like if Biden wins nationally by 4 to 5%, they will win those 2 seats. And with that, the vice president will break all ties in the Senate, and it will be a Democratic-controlled Senate. Now, well, what happens if Trump doesn't recover? If we're looking at a Trump loss of somewhere between 7 and 10? Well, then other seats come into play. Trump won Georgia by 5 points. Brian Kemp, the governor in 2018, won Georgia by less than 2 points. Again, massive swings against the Republicans in high-income suburbs of Atlanta. And Metro Atlanta cast roughly 60% of the votes throughout Georgia. There are 2 Republican senators up for re-election in Georgia this time. Then we have Montana, and I will get to Montana more specifically. But Montana is one place where you still have a tradition of split ticket voting. Trump could win by anywhere or lose by anywhere between 4 and 7 points, and Steve Bullock could still beat Steve Daines. Suddenly, if Biden wins nationally by 7, 8, 9 points, you have 2 Georgia seats and you have Montana falling, and suddenly the Democrats have 53 seats in the Senate. What happens if Trump doesn't improve at all? And we're looking at a 10 or 11 point loss, which is what the job approval rating would currently suggest he would lose by. Well, then we're talking about Iowa's Joni Ernst, who polls show is locked in a tight re-election battle, but Trump won Iowa, her state, by 10 points. Trump loses nationally by only 6 points. She probably wins by a couple of points. 3, 4, 5 points. Tough race, edge Ernst. 10 points, all bets are off. There's your 54th seat. And then you've got outlier seats like Texas or Alaska, seats where there's also been a historic Republican background, large movement against the president. There are Republican senators running for re-election there. You've got Kansas, which is not elected a Democrat to the Senate since 1932. But there's been a large multi-year move of moderates in suburbs of Kansas City away from Republicans and towards the Democrats. Not implausible to think that if Biden wins by 11 nationally, that the coalition that elected Democrat Laura Kelly to the governorship last time gives the Democrats the Kansas seat for the first time since Franklin Roosevelt started his first term. So those are the prospects that are out there and the factors that are driving those prospects. Now I want to talk a little bit about Montana. Montana has a history of ticket splitting that has not diminished in these years. John Tester won re-election over Matt Rosendale 2 years ago with over 50% of the vote, despite the fact that the exit poll showed that Donald Trump had a 51% job approval rating. It's not hard to understand why when you look at Montana election results. There is a constituency of a person who will flip between a Republican and a Democrat who they believe is not too liberal for Montana. The 2012 election is a perfect example of that. In 2012, the governor, the president, the House seat, and the Senate seat were all up. And you had Mitt Romney winning the presidency, you had John Tester winning the Senate seat, you had Steve Daines winning the House seat, and you had Steve Bullock winning the governor's mansion. Roughly 10 to 12% of Montanans almost certainly walked in and said, Romney, Tester, Daines, Bullock. That's the constituency that both sides are fighting over. That constituency has remained immune to the national partisan trends. It still exists. In 2018, John Tester's coalition was nearly identical to the coalition he assembled in 2012 on a county-by-county basis. The country partisanized, but Montana did not. So what that means is that you are at the cusp of a race where Steve Bullock has a very good chance of winning, although I would not say he is the favorite, as long as he can maintain plausibility that he is not a national Democrat as opposed to a Montana Democrat, that he is more like John Tester and less like Joe Biden. The Daines campaign, of course, will try and force him into being Joe Biden's clone in Helena. And The Bullock campaign will try and say, Montana man, not beholden to the national evil, Republicans who would do blah, 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 blah. That's the battle that you will see fighting out on your television screens, on your digital media, whatever media you consume, they will make sure that they've got themselves inserted into it. I'll be doing a piece on the Montana race that'll be published in the next couple of weeks, but I know enough about Montana demographics and patterns to know this is unlikely to be a race that moves highly in one direction or another because both candidates are well known. Montana seems relatively impervious to national trends. And Bullock's coalition in his two winning governor races mirrored Tester's nearly identically on a county by county basis. That he does a little bit better than Tester in his home county of Lewis and Clark and the neighboring county of Cascade. He does a little bit worse than Tester here around Gallatin, in Gallatin County. Daines is from Gallatin County. In his 2012 House race, he did significantly better than Romney. He'll probably do better even if he loses Gallatin, which is you're in the county in Montana that shifted the most between 2012 and 2016 against the Republicans. It is central to Bullock's election chances to maintain that shift among that soft college-educated former Republican who now doesn't like Trump. And Daines needs to say, hey, you know me personally. I grew up here. I went to high school here. I went to college here. I'm not this guy. I work with you. I work with Trump to get things for you. I don't know who's going to win this race, but you will be in one of the tightest, won't be most closely observed because you're 2 hours time zone different from DC, and DC and New York political reporters are incredibly myopic. But it'll be one of the most important races. And if we're talking about Trump losing by only 4 or 5%, this state is independent enough that it could very well still elect Bullock narrowly and provide the seat where the Democrats take control of the Senate, even if Trump narrowly wins an electoral college victory. To say that they win the 4 seats I mentioned earlier, and they win Montana, so they get a net gain of 5 seats rather than a net gain of 4 seats. There's a lot of stuff I've just thrown at you, a lot of details, a lot of numbers, a lot of things that I'm sure I haven't covered that are on your mind. So I would love now to stop and take your questions for the duration of the class. That clock is stopped, so I don't know where we stand. I will rely on one of 18 minutes. I hit my mark exactly. I was aiming for 20, so I was off by 10%. So we have 18 minutes in which I can take your questions, and please throw anything you want at me. Yes, sir. Can you, when you ask a question, can you remove your mask for the moment of the question so I can hear you clearly? I have a hearing issue, and I didn't wear my hearing aids. It's my fault.
But also yell, because that way the mic will so you can yell at him.
Yeah, if you can yell through the mask, yell through the mask. Yes, the Trump camp, everyone has recognized that white voters with a college degree tend to live in suburban areas. And their movement away has meant that places that were suburban and used to vote Republican are now voting Democratic. So the Trump campaign believes that the combination of protecting zoning in the suburbs and law and order will win back some of those voters. That's the theory. It has not been employed. I'm sorry, they've not been employing that long enough for us to know if that will succeed, but that is the theory. Yes, sir. And then I see you here. So there's a couple of questions in one there. One is, do the tactics of advertising on digital media work? Two is the question of, does the message they are advancing through those ads work? And three is even if A, it does, and B, it does, is it sufficient to overcome the overall concerns with respect to life in America after COVID-19? One, the political professionals across the world are increasingly moving from television to digital advertising. They believe it's effective. I have no reason to question those judgments. My first op-ed in the Wall Street Journal 31 years ago was in the world before the internet and before widespread desktop computers. And I was talking about voter targeting. And I said, voter targeting at that time, the only way you could effectively do it was through direct mail. Using complex databases through direct mail can effectively change the nature of campaigning, because you can talk to, you about public lands, and you about abortion, and you about lower taxes, because those are your hot button issues. That's what digital media allows you to do, combined with databases. So the technology has now caught up with the theory. That said, in a highly partisan election, the only media, people do not live in a digital bubble. They consume news outside of that. The ads aren't the only thing they see. So they're effective, but effective within a larger context. And that context is one that has been bad for Trump since COVID. And that is why you're seeing in the Republican National Convention basically hitting the restart button, which is, okay, now we have to actually address that people think we've mismanaged the crisis and try and show that we did the best we could under the circumstances, and then turn to an issue area where Trump still holds edges over Biden in many polls, which is who is best placed to restart the economy. People will say in the polls, who was best to manage COVID? They will say Biden by large numbers. But when you ask the question, who is best to restart the economy in the COVID environment, they will still narrowly plunk for Trump. So that's the message they're trying to pivot to. The overall message is, I'm sure their polling show it will work. The question is, every campaign has polling that shows that their issues will work, and then the issues collide with each other in the real world, and it's very difficult to predict. Is this more important? Is this, will somebody care more about Trump's tweeting and his general demeanor? Will they care more about the pattern of rioting that seems to be spreading? Nobody knows. All the pros will sit there and tell you, my way is going to win. No, they're just making the best argument they can. It's like if you're a lawyer and you're arguing before a jury, you make the best argument you can, but only a fool will say, I am certain that my argument will win. And so I hope that answers all three of your questions. Okay, yes, sir, you're next. And then did you want to, okay, I thought I saw a tentative hand going up.
Talk about the split.
Well, that'll be one of the key fissure points for the Democratic Party, is that there were two things that polling showed during the Democratic Party primary, is that the less progressive you were, the more likely you were to back Joe Biden or one of the non-highly progressive competitors, whereas the more progressive you were, the more likely you were to back Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. The other is age, that the older you were, the more likely you were to back Joe Biden, and the less likely you were to back Bernie Sanders. That suggests, although it doesn't prove, that there is a shift on generational terms, which is say that the Democratic parties will, which is currently roughly 60-40 or 2/3, 1/3, including some of these former Republicans who are participating in Democratic primaries, although most don't. Most are still, they'll vote Democratic in general, but they won't vote in the primary. It's still roughly 60-40, 66-33 against the progressive. However, the demographics suggest that progressive strength will grow over the next decade and moderate strength will wane unless the Democrats, who are moderates, succeed in getting even more Republicans to think of themselves as Democrats and not just renting their vote out. And that's one of the things that you can see with Biden, is that Biden has a peculiar but very underrated political skill. He, throughout his career, is less of somebody who is a liberal or a moderate or this or that than somebody who finds where the center of the Democratic Party is at any instant and occupies it vociferously. Now, you can laugh at that, as many of you just did. And that's why I say it's an underrated skill. But what that means is that he can build coalitions. in an efficient way. And in a two-party system, you have to be able to build a coalition and keep it. Biden's unique skill set as a politician allows him to find the place to keep that coalition together, which explains why he has moved to the left over the past 2 years. I am sure it is out of conviction. Pick up the irony in my voice, but it is certainly good politics. The threat comes if the new former Republicans don't move to the left with him. If the party moves to the left and he moves to the left, he creates a center within the Democratic Party, but the key votes that gets them over the 50% margin are people outside of the Democratic coalition. The thing to watch for in a Biden administration is the degree to which these people, who are the people who will elect Steve Bullock to Senate if he wins, who are the people who elected the 30 House members who are in districts Trump won, are the people who elected Kristen Sinema in Arizona, people who elected Tester here, people who elected Joe Manchin in West Virginia. In other words, the difference between 45% of the House and 53% of the House. The more this center between the progressives and the moderates moves this way, the more distance you have between the center and the people who decide elections. If they do not also move to the left, so that the distance remains roughly the same, this creates an opportunity for a very fast Republican comeback if the Republicans can overcome the toxic elements of the Trump legacy and build on the policy areas where there is potential agreement between the Republican coalition, which itself is divided because in two parties there are always divided coalitions, and these people in the center who stand between the two-party coalition. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, there's 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I apologize. Very Can you just briefly comment on that?
So 2016 saw a drop in African-American turnout, both in absolute numbers and in percentage of the electorate. And this was due to two reasons. One is turnout was up among whites, particularly whites without a college degree, that had been down in 2012 and it came back up. And turnout, President Obama turned out African-American voters who had never voted before, but they only voted when Obama was on the ballot. They did not vote in 2010. They did not vote in 2014. Some of them voted in 2016. This is the thing the Democrats don't want to talk about, is that in many places, Black turnout was higher as a percentage or in numbers than in pre-Obama years, but it was lower than the Obama high point. Some people believe that they can get up to the Obama high point with Kamala Harris on the ticket. That's a theory. We'll see if it works. If that happens, that makes Trump's job in the Midwestern states that he needs to win that much harder, because if you add 1 or 2% of the total electorate in African-American turnout, that roughly shifts the margin, since African-Americans vote roughly 90 to 95% Democratic. It shifts the margin by between 1.5% and 2% to the Democrat, roughly double the increase. So if they are successful at getting Obama-level turnouts among African-Americans, that means Trump has to work even harder to win the upper Midwest states where you have African-Americans in Milwaukee, in Detroit, in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, and in other areas. It is less the case. It is not the case in Iowa because there's virtually no African-American constituency in Iowa. Iowa is 90-something% white, and the minority that has more voting members is Latinos rather than African-Americans. Latino turnout went up in 2016, largely because Latinos are, more and more Latinos who are born in the United States age into citizenship, and when they age into citizenship, they age into voting. We should expect more Latino voters. However, in 2018, Latino turnout was not up as much as it was in white college areas. And Republican shares of the vote in Latino areas did not go down. The shift that happened in 2018 that put the Democrats in power was a white phenomenon. not a turnout among minorities phenomenon. And polls have been showing all throughout the last 2 years of Trump's presidency that Trump will likely get a couple percent more in the Latino vote than he got in 2016. That was true before COVID. It is true during COVID. He got, I believe, 29%, according to the exit poll, of the Latino vote. He should get between 31 and 35%. And he's certainly trying to target that vote. And that is a complicating factor that the national media and Democrats tend not to recognize. With respect to other minorities, they tend not to be electorally significant in states that are up for grabs. Most Asians live in safe states, so they can vote more Democratic and they can turn out in larger numbers, but New Jersey, New York, and California and Hawaii are going to vote Democratic anyway, so it just increases their margin. Multiracial voters are also, or voters that don't fall neatly, such as Muslim voters, Muslims of non-American descent tend to be around 0.5% of the American electorate, maybe up to 1.5% in a place like Michigan. It will only matter in a really close election. The real game is to look at African-American voters where there is something in play, and Hispanic voters where Democrats try to make something in play, but the data don't really suggest that they're succeeding. So what order did I say I was going to go in? I want to return to that order. Yes. Yeah, so let me summarize what I was trying to say in that was that Washington's primary tends to mirror the general election. The turnout in the Washington primary was a massive record high, like 77% of the turnout in 2016, which was itself a record high. So both on turnout and its past record of mirroring the general election, this is an early snapshot. And what it showed was that there is an upsurge in non-suburban, non-big city areas that the polls nationally do not seem to be picking up. That would be the only proof I've got of the silent majority, which is a stupid phrase because it's not a majority, but the shy Trump voter phenomena, which would mean maybe, yes, Trump's behind by 11 points in job approval rating, but maybe in reality it's only 7. Maybe the polls say he's behind by 7 with Biden, but maybe it's only 4.5. That's a big Republican theory. It's kind of like, going back to my Who Wants to Be a Millionaire days, I had 3 lifelines. Well, this is the big one for the Republicans. You know, the polls are bad. Well, call a friend. You know, the shy Republican theory. I've been dismissive of that, but this is data that is suggestive that some of that may be true, and that was the point I wanted to make. Oh God, no. But what it does, again, what it means is that, like I said in the piece, there's Jaime Herrera Butler, who's the Republican incumbent in the district centered on Vancouver, Washington, which is a suburb of Portland. That's on the Democratic target list. She won 56-40. There is 0% chance she's going to lose. Okay, don't believe if you're a progressive and you get something on your sale, you know, give to Carolyn Long. She's going to beat Jaime Herrera Butler. Don't waste your money. It also means that there's a seat that Republicans have written off for dead. Suburban Seattle, it's a historically Republican seat in Seattle that flipped. Republicans combined won that by 1.5 points on a turnout that's like 80% of what the turnout's going to be or was in 2016. As I said in the piece, no party has gone from losing combined in the primary to winning in the general. Everybody in Washington says Jesse Jensen, who saw my article and now can't wait to be interviewed by me because he wants the national. I haven't responded to his email. But you know, my point is that everyone's written that seat off. But Washington's data suggests this seat's very much in play. There was only a 1.5 point shift to the Republicans. It was much less than was the case in, but I haven't looked at county by county. It combines urban, suburban counties and crosses the Cascades into rural counties. And what I want to see is whether or not the overall district shift was caused in the rural counties and not in the suburban counties. But Washington's going to go Democratic by double digits, and the only question is the margin. Yes, ma'am. Sure, and the reason why is because his voters are larger shares of the electorate in states with large numbers of electoral college votes. So Wisconsin is a good example. Wisconsin, he narrowly won by something like 30,000 votes or something, 20,000 votes. He got all 10 of Wisconsin's electoral votes. And that's because whites without a college degree are somewhere around 55% of the electorate. Whereas nationally, they're something like 35% of the electorate. The same is true in Michigan, where they're at or close to 50%. The same is true in Pennsylvania, where in the high 40s. The same is true in Iowa, where they are between 55 and 60% of the electorate. The same is true in Ohio. The 5 blue states that he flipped in the Midwest are all states where the white working class population is a significantly higher share of the population than it is nationally. And because of our system, that's why I called his minority coalition electorally efficient, because as long as he keeps his support there and keeps enough of the whites in the suburbs with college degrees on his side, he can win a majority in the electoral college even while losing nationally. Yes, ma'am. All right, I'll take this last question and be fast. I'm sorry. Since Vince interjected, blame him. It doesn't at all. Kellyanne is a personal friend of my fiance. She's somebody who was at my wedding when she was dating the man she was dating before George. She's a fine person, and I think it is terrible what has happened, but I think the decision that she and George, because George is also stepping down from his role, criticizing the president. You probably don't see this, but because they're friends, we do. The daughter erupted on social media over the weekend talking about abuse, and she wants to go for emancipation and free herself from her parents' tyranny. I think the parents finally stepped back and said, enough of our feud. Let's protect our daughter. And I think that's the right decision. And I think everyone, regardless of what you think of Kellyanne as a political person or Trump, I think you should applaud their mature decision to put their family first. Thank you for your time. Work for you, Bob? Yeah, I'm sorry.